Peak human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
Shikhar Manush.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Piczówka niewiód.
Hello, good people. I hope you all had a joyous Thanksgiving. I certainly did, with some friends up in Seattle for a Sapien-style dinner, finishing the Game Changers Debunked film, having the awesome meetup and film viewing, hanging with everyone's favorite Dr. Ted Naiman, and then going to Mike Mutzel's house and backyard farm for a podcast. A bit more info on each. Mike Mutzel is known as Metabolic Mike and has a long-standing podcast called High Intensity Health. Go check him out. He's a great guy. Everyone should be familiar with the Game Changers Debunked film by now. There's 2 versions out on YouTube as of late, one with the deleted scenes and one with just the info and none of the gags. When we started this on Halloween, Sean Baker, Chris Kruger, and I had the idea to make some skits and have some fun with this. I appreciate the fact that not everyone is looking for that, so we have both options. Lastly, a sapien way of eating, for anyone unfamiliar, is how a growing number of people are characterizing how they eat and live. It encompasses many dietary strategies, from pescatarian all the way to keto and carnivore. It has a sweet spot, where I like to be, with over 90% of calories coming from animal foods. This makes it high fat, low carb, and mainly has you running on fat. It is nose to tail. It embraces smaller feeding windows of 1 meal per day to 2 meals in 8 hours, which I like. It is based on all whole foods. It's also not based on any dogma. Humans have evolved to eat many things over millions of years, and even in the last 10,000 years. It also focuses on other lifestyle factors like getting quality sleep, exercise, sun, etc. You can learn more at sapien.org/diet. You can also learn about the grass-finished meat at nosetotale.org that's shipped to the 48 states. It's all grown ethically, organically, and sustainably. We have unique and nutrient-dense foods such as primal ground beef that includes liver, heart, kidney, and spleen. We also have high omega-3 pork and chicken that blows away conventional and even organically grown animals. I'm proud to offer these products delivered to your home, but also encourage people to find local farmers and source from them. Now on to a food producer I'd also love to endorse, whose meat you can get if you're in the North Dakota area, Mr. Gabe Brown. I saw a TEDx talk of his 2 years ago and had a long call with him soon after. I wanted to include him in the film, but it didn't quite work out. I'm glad we finally reconnected and found some time to record a talk. Gabe Brown is a farmer and leader in the movement towards regenerative agriculture. He is the owner of Brown's Ranch, just east of Bismarck, North Dakota. He believes in and practices holistic management, a part of which is farming and ranching in nature's image. At his ranch, improving soil health is a priority, and no-till farming has been practiced since 1993. His ranch has eliminated the use of synthetic fertilizers, fungicides, and pesticides. He does not use any GMOs or glyphosate. His ever-evolving grazing strategy allows most of his pastures a recovery period of over 360 days. All of these practices have led to the health of the soil, mineral, and water cycles to greatly improve, and of course the quality of the agriculture and livestock he produces as well. Make sure to listen to the end. There's some great info all the way through. He has solutions to some huge worldwide problems with simple and proven practices. Last quick things, Food Lies is going strong. We have a new and awesome graphics guy that is really savvy with all his info and is eager to help the cause. Please support this podcast by giving a review on iTunes or the podcast app. And also support our endeavors on Patreon at patreon.com/peakhuman. We're doing the extended show notes each week with all the extra info and studies, and also creating some new video content. There's been a high demand for my 14-minute workout. I'm going to make videos available to Patreon supporters of this and more about eating and other lifestyle practices that won't be available to the public. Appreciate everyone's support. And now let's hear from the spectacular Gabe Brown. All right. Hello, Gabe Brown. How are you doing today? Where are you calling in from?
I'm actually home this week. So I'm calling in from the ranch near Bismarck, North Dakota.
That's great. Yeah, you've been on the road. We scheduled this months ago, actually. What have you been up to?
Well, it's been kind of a eventful past couple of years as 3 other people and myself started a couple businesses that focus on regenerative agriculture and focus on educating others as to the hows, whys of regenerative ag and the importance of regenerative ag. And those business entities have kind of exploded, to say the least. So that's exciting, but it's keeping me on the road a little more than maybe I'd like to be.
Well, that's okay. Great. Yeah. So what exactly are you doing?
Well, Dr. Alan Williams, Ray Archuleta, Shane New, and myself started a business called Understanding Ag, and we are a for-profit consulting company, and we consult on farms and ranches and for businesses all over North America, helping to move farmers, ranchers, and businesses and organizations down the regenerative path. And then we also have, along with David Brown, formed a nonprofit called Soil Health Academy. And our goal there is we travel around putting on 3-day intensive schools as to the hows and whys of regenerative agriculture. And there it's actually hands-on in the field. We hold those schools on farms and ranches that are using regenerative practices, and to give people a better awareness of what is regenerative ag and how do they apply the 6 principles of a healthy ecosystem to their own farm or ranch in order to move their operations forward.
Yeah, that's great. I'm in the middle of your book, Dirt to Soil. Actually, we talked 2 years ago when I first started making this film. I talked about, I saw your TEDx presentation. So anyone listening can check that out on YouTube. If you just look up Gabe Brown TEDx, you'll find that, which is awesome. But yeah, you've been on my radar for a while. I was almost going to try to film with you at your farm in North Dakota. But why don't you give us super high level of where you came from and then where your farm is now, just so people can kind of get a grasp of what you've done.
Sure. So our ranch is located directly adjacent to the city of Bismarck in south central North Dakota. And I was not born and raised on a farm. I grew up in the city of Bismarck, and I became interested in agriculture by taking a vocational agriculture course in the 9th grade. And I just became infatuated with production agriculture. And I knew I wanted to be tied to that somehow. Well, I actually started down my secondary education to become a vocational agriculture instructor. But then, as luck would have it, fell in love with a young lady whose parents had a farm. And my wife has 2 sisters, and her parents asked if we'd be interested in taking over the ranch. And so that's what happened. Graduated from college and moved on to the ranch here. And after farming alongside my in-laws for 8 years, we were able to purchase part of the ranch from them. And we've grown the operation now to where it's about 5,000 acres. Now, the ranch was an of the conventional mindset, and I learned to farm and ranch in that conventional mindset. My wife and I purchased it in 1991. At that time, it was farmed like any other farm around here. Very heavy tillage, monoculture production, the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and fungicides. And the cattle were set stock, not rotationally grazed. That's how we started out. I was always very open-minded, having not grown up on a farm or ranch. I would read, and I have an appetite for learning. And I was reading about no-till, and it just made sense to me. And so after purchasing the farm in 91, we farmed conventionally a couple years. And then I had read enough about no-till to think this really makes sense. I need to quit tilling this soil. And so we sold our tillage equipment and bought a no-till drill. And 1994 was our first year of 100% zero-till. We have been 100% zero-till ever since. And then what changed the direction for me was we actually had 1995 came along, and the day before I was going to start combining my spring wheat crop, we lost 100% of the crop to hail. Well, that was pretty devastating, set us back quite a bit financially. So 1996 came along, and I started to diversify the crop rotation a little bit, added a few other species of crops, and we lost 100% of the crop to hail again. So 2 years of zeros in the crop production, pretty devastating. 1997 came along and we dried out. It was severe drought in this area. Nobody harvested any crops. So that was 3 years in a row. And it was at that time that I heard a rancher from Alberta, Don Campbell, give a presentation. And he said this. He said, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. But if you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. And there's not a day that has gone by since then that I haven't thought about that saying. And that I knew right when I heard it that that's what I had to do. I had to look at things differently. And so I became a student again, and I really started studying nature. And what's nature trying to tell me? How does nature function? Because realize 3 years of no crop income, the bank wasn't going to loan me money for operating anymore. I had to learn how I'm going to make this ranch profitable without all these inputs. Well, 1998 came along, and as fate would have it, we got hailed out again. We lost 80% of our crop to hail that year. And so 4 years of zero crop income really propelled me on a path of I've got to learn how nature functions. But I tell people, the good Lord decided that, hey, he's going to pick the simplest farmer out there and teach him these lessons over a period of 4 years. Because I had already gone no-till, but what I learned in those 4 years were things like after the hailstorm, all of a sudden I had armor. That crop was beat down on the ground. Well, that was the protection that the soil needs, protected from wind erosion, water erosion, evaporation. And then because of financial difficulties, I started to diversify my operation. Well, that's another principle. We need diversity back into agriculture. And then I tell people I started to plant these fall seeded biennials because of those hailstorms. I didn't know what I was doing back then, but I needed to grow feed for the livestock. And I needed to capture some of those nutrients that were in the soil and put them into a living plant. So I was learning the principle of a living root in the soil as long as possible throughout the year. And then in 1998, when we had our third hailstorm, fourth year of natural disasters, that occurred a little earlier in the year. That occurred in June. Well, I went in and I seeded a mix of sorghum, sudan grass, and cowpeas. And I literally did not have the money to buy the twine to bale that hay up. So I left it stand. I left that forage standing and just turned my cows out on it in the winter. Well, that was animal integration on cropland, another principle. So I tell people I learned all these things the long, slow, hard way. But the important thing is I did learn from them. And now since then, NRCS and others have coined the saying that these are the 5 principles of soil health. Now, recently, my partners and I added a 6th one, and that principle is context, that we have to farm and ranch in our context, because too many people are trying to grow crops in environments where they shouldn't be grown, or like we're draining the Ogallala aquifer and other aquifers by putting on too much irrigated water. We're farming and ranch out of context, and we have to get back to that.
I love that. Yeah, the 6th one. I didn't know about your 6th one. There's so many things we should get back into. I love that you were raised in the city too. I remember that from your book, and that I love that I wrote this down, that you had no preconceived notions about farming, which really helped, right? You weren't just in that system and indoctrinated into the way that everyone was doing things, although you did actually start doing things the conventional way.
Yep, and that's right. I learned from my school, what I was taught in school at university, and then I really learned from my father-in-law, but I learned the way he was doing things. And I remember in the spring of the year, we'd go out and would till the fields, and he'd tell me, now we're just trying to dry it out so we can seed. And that never made any sense to me, because we're in an area that only gets about 10 to 12 inches of rainfall a year, and then another 4 to 5 inches of precipitation from snow. And so we're always dry. We're always looking for moisture. And so I'm like, why would we want to till and lose that moisture? So I kind of I learned, then I unlearned, and now I'm relearning. And the more I know I don't know, and that's the beautiful thing about working in production agriculture. There's always things to learn.
Yeah, and I love that. Learning things the hard way sometimes is the best, because it really sinks in. And I talk to a lot of doctors on this podcast, and they go through the whole medical system. And the only way that they reverse out of all those teachings is the hard way. And, some of these doctors, they're, 100 pounds overweight, and they had themselves type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, and they're trying to treat patients with the same disease. So they had to figure it out the hard way and came to these different conclusions.
Right.
Yeah. So before we even move on, can you tell people just the difference between tilling and no-till? Because it seems so simple and basic, but a lot of people have never stepped foot on a ranch before or farm.
Well, sure. To till the soil is to disturb it. to take an implement such as a chisel plow or a plow and invert the soil upside down, more or less. And most people are familiar with the garden. They till their garden to prepare the seed bed, to get rid of the weeds, to kill the weeds, and then make this nice, smooth, fine seed bed to allow them to plant their garden vegetables. Well, in large-scale production agriculture, many do the same thing. But what we don't realize is the detrimental effect that has, is that the soil needs to be left intact. All nutrients that a plant receives come about via soil biology. And that biology, the soil is their home. The soil is like a subaquatic ecosystem. Biology in the soil lives in and on thin films of water in those pore spaces between the soil aggregate. Well, if we destroy that, what happens? We destroy the home for biology. We destroy the home for biology. How are the plants going to get the nutrients it needs? And I speak a lot to homeowners and urban dwellers, and many of them have gardens. And I ask them, how many of you till your garden? Well, you're actually negatively affecting the nutrient density of those vegetables and other produce that you're growing in your garden. Why would you want to do that? You know, it's the same on a farm or ranch. Why would we want to do that? We want to leave that soil ecosystem intact.
Yeah, it's kind of like the nutrition world where everything's backwards, where we just learn things one way and then we think that's the way to do them. I mean, isn't there zero evidence that tilling helps?
That's right. They're actually, everything we're trying to do in production agriculture, tillage is just the opposite of that. You know, it actually promotes more weeds because in a natural ecosystem, the soil wants to be covered. So plants grow. Well, that's why we get weeds, is because we till. And then, you know, in order to produce to a crop or vegetables, fruit, whatever the case may be, we want to feed those plants nutrients. Well, we think by tilling, we're benefiting the plant. Really, it's having a negative effect on the plant. So we need to get away from that altogether. I'm a firm believer there's no place in production agriculture for tillage.
It's crazy because 99% of America does this, and it's just how we're taught to do it. It's like, oh yeah, you just strip the land, you just plant one crop, and you put a bunch of pesticides on it, and that's how you do things. We're like, no, there's so many people out there doing the exact opposite like you are now. Luckily, there's a lot of people learning about this. And okay, I want to cover your principles because you kind of covered them. It's limited disturbance, armor, diversity, living roots, integrated animals, and context. I don't know if those are the exact words you used, but you just added context as the last one. So you're talking right now about limited disturbance, right? Is there more to
right.
it?
That's right. Well, not only limited from a physical aspect, the act of tilling, but also limited chemical disturbance. You know, so often in production agriculture, they're putting on copious amounts of chemicals, whether it be herbicides to kill weeds or fungicides to kill fungal diseases or pesticides to kill pests. We need to limit that also. You know, nature is very resilient, but we got to at least give her half a chance. Unfortunately, much of production agriculture today doesn't do that. You know, all we've done in production agriculture is mine the past centuries of carbon and of energy that have been taken out of the atmosphere and stored in the soil. And now because of that, we're releasing CO2 in the atmosphere, and we don't have anymore the ability of our soils to hold that energy, to hold those nutrients, to produce viable crops without all these synthetic inputs.
Yeah. And how did we ever decide to till in the first place? Like, who made this up and when?
Well, tillage has been around since biblical times. They actually, you know, you can see in the Great Pyramids, there's pictures of tillage equipment, and they talk about tilling the soil and hoeing in order to plant seeds. But, you know, I'm going to blame John Deere for inventing the plow, and that as far as in North America, that was really the push to start destroying and plowing up these vast grasslands that we once had that were very, very productive and very healthy. And we did that, to plant monoculture crops. Well, if you look at it today, how much of the crops we produce are really consumed by humans? It's a very, very small amount. Most of it goes to either produce ethanol or to produce feed for livestock. And unfortunately, we're feeding some species of livestock grain that did not evolve eating grain. That has a negative ramification on the nutrient density of their products, the meat itself. And so we need to realize that we really don't need as much land in grain production as we think.
Yeah. Well, and people can do a simple thought experiment of what happened in North America for thousands and millions of years before that nature had the cycle and ruminants and different megafauna grazed on it and it grew and moved on and there was no tilling. You said in the book, nature doesn't till.
That's right. Nature tills in the way of earthworms and burrowing animals, but it doesn't till like we do. We do in production agriculture, where we're inverting large amount of acreage over just to plant monoculture production. That just doesn't happen. Go ahead.
Oh, no. Well, it just doesn't even make sense. Like we're kind of talking about two things at once too. We're talking about the animals grazing and just, growing crops, but they both don't make sense separately how we're doing them. I was just going back to my sort of, thought experiment where you're just thinking about these plains, like all the grass, everything existed perfectly beforehand.
That's right. And when I went through those 4 years, I found some solace I'm blessed on our ranch. We have several thousand acres of what we call native prairie. Now, I haven't been around for centuries, so who am I to say what truly is native or not? But to my knowledge, has never been tilled. And it's a very, very diverse grassland. And if you look at how that ecosystem functions, there's all these different species of grasses, of forbs, of legumes. Then you have all these different animals on it and insects, and that creates a very healthy ecosystem. What I did was I observed that native prairie ecosystem, and I use this as an example. For 5 years, my son taught rangeland management at the local community college, and he brought his students out to one of our quote unquote native pastures, and he had them collect different species, grasses, forbs, legumes. And in 2 hours, they collected over 140 different species of plants. Now, that's a tremendous amount of diversity. And then you drive across rural America today, and what do you see? Well, you see corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, just a handful of species make up the landscape. That's not conducive to a healthy ecosystem.
It's all about the ecosystem. That's the only thing that matters, diversity and ecosystem. And yeah, I guess you just hit on that again, just how unnatural it is to have a monocrop when all that matters is how many.
There's some really good data out there. Dr. Tillman, University of Minnesota, he measured plant biomass on one axis and then species diversity on the other. As you increase species diversity, plant biomass increases dramatically. And the reason for that is plants take in sunlight. Well, the more different leaf sizes and shapes you have, the more photosynthesis that's occurring. Through photosynthesis, then, plants produce all these amino acids, sugars, all these different compounds. They use part of it for growth, and then they pump part of it, leak it out through the roots. Root exudates to attract biology to provide the nutrients that the plant needs to grow. Well, the more diversity you have, the more sunlight you're going to collect, and the more of these elements you're going to pump into the soil, these compounds. So that benefits all of them. And then he also did some work, plant biomass production and functional diversity. By that, he means grasses, forbs, legumes. The more functional diversity you have, the more biomass. What Dr. Tillman was showing us is that diversity is key. When you understand how soils function, soils need living plants. It's kind of a chicken and the egg. Plant and soil are one. You have to have both. You cannot have healthy soil without living plants, because it's living plants that bring the compounds into the soil, the elements, to feed all the biology. when you understand that there's more microorganisms in a teaspoonful of healthy soil than there are people on this planet. Yet how many farmers, ranchers, gardeners think about feeding that biology in the soil? Well, the only way to feed that biology is through living plants. And it's kind of like you're asking the difference between monoculture production and diverse polyculture production. Well, how would you like to only eat one thing every day?
Yeah.
When we plant a monoculture, whether it be in our garden or in a field, we're only feeding that biology specific root exudates. When we have diversity, many different plant species, we're feeding that biology a wide array of different elements. And that's what is needed to feed the biology. Then the biology in turn feeds the plant. And that plant then produces all these plant secondary metabolites, your phenols, your alkaloids, everything that really drives human health. So we have to have a healthy soil in order to have healthy plants, in order to have healthy animals, in order to have healthy people.
I love it. I don't understand how people can't figure this out. This is the most basic thing ever. We're just stuck in this system. Well, here, let's get to the system later, because you told me some stuff a couple of years ago that opened my eyes to how we're stuck in this system. But what about the soil health? And you're talking about these plants that signal for nutrients. And I started learning about this recently, that plants can actually signal what they need.
Oh, it's absolutely amazing what happens, the communication that goes on in the soil. There's really phenomenal research that's being done right now. One researcher, Dr. Jack Schultz, University of Missouri, is showing that plants have the ability, if they need a certain nutrient, they can release certain root exudates to attract biology to bring them that nutrient. Now, what's mind-blowing about it, though, that he's found out is a plant next to that plant. Say you have one plant that's sloughing off these root exudates in order to attract biology to bring it zinc. Well, the plant next to that plant can say, hey, my neighbor here is sending out root exudates to get zinc. I'll just steal some of that, but I'm going to send root exudates out to have biology bring me copper. So these plants are interacting and communicating with each other, and it's an absolute fascinating study of soil microbiology.
It's so cool. It's so cool. We're learning more. We think of plants as just these dumb things, but I've heard just these fungus networks that are just like thousands of acres, and they're all connected, and all the root networks are connected. It's so cool. And also I wanted to talk about this upcycling of nutrients. You're talking about it starts in the soil, then it gets into the plants, and then it gets into the humans. It's such a perfect system of upcycling nutrients. And this Game Changers film, I don't know if you saw this vegan propaganda film by James Cameron and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they're talking about they're just saying animals are the middlemen. It's like there's no reason to eat animals, they're just the middlemen. It's such a stupid way to think about things.
Yeah.
And they're not getting
and it's beyond that. We hear a lot of people say, oh, well, animals are ruining the ecosystem, we got to get animals off and that. No, we have a saying, it's not the cow, it's the how.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is we put animals in confinement, and animals didn't evolve to be in confinement. And then we use all these fossil fuels to haul all these nutrients, all the feed, et cetera, to the livestock. Then we got to dispose of all the manure. That system, I'm sorry, just doesn't make sense, quite frankly. We need the animals out on the landscape. And the reason being, plants evolved over time to be bitten off by an animal. And when that happens, that plant then sends signals down to the roots, hey, I need to slough off root exudates to attract biology to regrow. When that happens, what else happens? That plant starts taking in more carbon, more elements out of the atmosphere. That's how we're really going to draw down carbon out of the atmosphere. CO2 is through that process. And there's many of us now who are researching and studying how much carbon we've been able to sequester, so to speak, out of the atmosphere and put in the soil. And it's all about this harmony, this synchrony between plants and animals and the sun and then the soil ecosystem, all working in harmony to cycle the nutrients. and to provide the nutrients that are needed to the plant.
Yeah, this is how it worked. Again, talk about we used to have like migrating ruminants, and you can mimic that with rotational grazing. Yeah, and just the biting and what is it called? Stimulating.
If you can imagine back centuries ago over much of North America, and it didn't matter where you look at, from the East Coast to the West Coast, from Mexico on up through Canada, there was large herds of bison and elk that they would move and they would migrate more or less according to forage production, the seasons, and they were kept on the move by predators. Well, what would happen? Those animals moving in these large herds, they would graze some, they would trample, they would defecate, urinate, and then they're not going to stay there because that forage is trampled, and the predators would push them, they'd move on. And they often wouldn't return for 6 months, a year, sometimes even more. It's documented that they wouldn't take the same paths. Their migration and movement would depend on the year and the production of forage. Well, by not coming back, that allowed ample time for those plants to recover, and they would recover even stronger. And I equate it to this. So it's like an athlete training for the Olympics. If you're training to be a weightlifter, you're not going to lift the same amount of weights every day. That isn't going to get you anywhere. Well, it's the same with these animals moving across the landscape. It'd be different numbers of animals, slightly different timing. That's what builds resiliency into an ecosystem. And so by managing livestock in that way now, we can mimic what nature did centuries ago. So on our ranch, for instance, we run approximately 1,000 head of beef animals on our ranch, and we're moving those animals every day. And we will go out, we'll set up a temporary fence, move the animals, they will graze there for one day, the next day we'll set up another fence and move them. Then we'll allow ample recovery time to those plants.
So the cattle grazes one area of land and they get their nutrition, they stimulate the grass growth by eating it, and then they move on. It's so amazing. So how often do they come back around, and what do you use? It just a line of electric fence?
It's very, very simple what we do. And people say, oh, that's a lot of work putting up electric fence every day. It's the most enjoyable part of our day. I mean, you're out there in nature with the animals, and it doesn't take any time. The technology of electric fencing today is really pretty simple. And people think, oh, electric fencing, that's hard on the animals. They only touch the fence once and they're trained. We wouldn't even have to turn the fencer on to give them a shock. They know when they see us coming, oh, it's like turning me into a buffet,
Fresh food.
Yeah, there's fresh food and a smorgasbord. Who wouldn't like that? We sell most of our products direct to consumers. And often our consumers ask us about, well, how do you treat your animals? And my son says, well, if I was an animal, I'd want to be raised on Brown's Ranch. And that's the way to answer it. The animals have a very good life because they're getting adequate nutrition, fresh forage every day. It's good for the plant community because that plants then have adequate time to recover. Now, you asked me how long of a recovery time. That gets back to the principle of context. And in our drier environment, we won't come back and graze the same paddock for normally 12 to 14 months. So that forage in those plants have a year to recover. Now, in wetter environments, of course, you could graze, they'd be fully recovered, and you'd come back and graze it sooner. But it's all about context, and that's what works in our environment. So that's what we do. Now, think of the other ramifications that occur because we're not coming back to that spot for a year. Look what that does for insect populations, for wildlife populations. Even though we're adjacent to the city of Bismarck, the wildlife on our ranch it's a mecca for wildlife because the animals, our livestock, are only in one little fraction of the ranch every day. Wildlife have access to all the rest, and it's home and habitat for them. So because of that, we literally have easily 30 to 50 times as much wildlife as neighboring farms and ranches. Easily.
That's great. Did you see The Biggest Little Farm? That
Yeah,
film?
yes, I
Is
did.
is that so? Are they doing things well? That it seems like they are on the same page as you, and they have such a great diversity of wildlife and all this stuff.
Sure they are. It was a fantastic film.
Awesome. Yeah, people should check that out. I think is it on iTunes or
It is on Netflix.
Netflix now? Okay, great. So what about getting them water? You had an interesting story of figuring out how to get them water as they go to each paddock.
Yeah, and back when I actually started rotational grazing back in the late 80s before we even bought the ranch from my in-laws. And we started then just unrolling some polyethylene pipe out and then getting them water that way. Now we have buried shallow pipelines throughout most of the 5,000 acres of this ranch. And so the livestock have fresh water. We have it approximately every 20 to 40 acres, which is relatively close for an animal to walk. And so they have access to fresh water all the time. In the winter months, our cows actually do fine on snow. They live on snow. The bison weren't drinking fresh water during the winter on the northern plains. Well, our cattle can do fine on snow too. And some people might say, oh, that's cruel. Well, no, that's how ecosystems function.
You talked about bale grazing too. It's like just not growing all the crops somewhere and then shipping them in to give them to the cow on your property. So how did that come about? And just how does it work with different cover crops and forages? And
Right. Well, for years, what I used to do and what most cattlemen, livestock producers do, whether you're raising beef cattle, dairy cattle, sheep, goats, doesn't matter, horses, they go out and they cut hay, bale up that hay, haul that hay into a farmyard. Then every day during the winter, they start a tractor and feed that hay to the livestock. Then the next spring, they have to haul all that manure out of the corral and put it out on the landscape. That just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I credit the Canadians for teaching me this. They started what was called bale grazing, where no, you go out there, you still put up the hay in the summer, but then you leave the bales there in the field. Then during the winter, you just turn the cattle in on those bales, cattle, sheep, goats, whatever species. And they eat the hay out on the land. So any carbon that's left, any remaining hay that's left is there on the land to cycle through, plus all the manure and urine and everything from the cattle or livestock are out on the land also. So you save yourself all the time and energy and fossil fuels of hauling that feed in, of starting the tractor every day, of all the labor to feed every day all winter, of hauling the manure back out. It's just a much, much easier way of doing things. Now, I do want to say we only bale graze for a very short time during the winter. Other than that, our animals are out grazing. And I tell people, if you don't think that an animal would rather be out grazing, go open the gate on the corral once and see, are they going to stay in the corral or are they going to go out? I'll guarantee you they'll go out.
Yeah. And yeah, so you're saying you only need to bale graze if you have to, and you're up in North Dakota, and I mean other people in wetter climates, they just would never have to do that.
Well, I laugh because as I travel around, just last week I was in North Carolina, and they're feeding hay in North Carolina some producers, not all of them, some producers 3 times longer than I am. And I'm up here where, we've already had 25 inches of snow this year, It's like this whole system, it goes to show just how out of balance this production model we're in today is.
Yeah, well, this is the part where it makes me mad because I deal with a lot of vegan activists. They find me online and all that. And you're talking about the simplest way to do things that's way more efficient. It is better for the environment. It's better, less fossil fuels, all this stuff. And if everyone just did this, then there would be no problem.
No, this would be a much, much. I tell people this, these regenerative practices, more than anything else, have the ability to bring society together. Okay, If you're worried about climate change, and let's face it, there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere, not enough in our soils, regenerative agriculture has the ability more than anything else to help pull that CO2 out of the atmosphere, put it back into the soil where it belongs. If you're worried about water quality, I mean, look at what's happening in our estuaries on the coasts, in the Great Lakes, in the Mississippi, into the Gulf of Mexico, the Ogallala. No matter where you go, they're talking about water. Well, use my ranch as an example. Before I went down this path, we could only infiltrate into the soil. If it rained, we could only infiltrate a half of an inch of rainfall per hour. Well, that's not very much. Now, today, we can easily infiltrate over 30 inches per hour. Now, I've never, ever seen it rain that much. We actually have it on videotape where we're able to infiltrate an inch of rain in 9 seconds and the second inch in an additional 16 seconds. So 2 inches in 25 seconds. I've never seen it rain that hard. Okay. So think of what that'll do. Then you add to it, we're able to infiltrate the water. Think of all the flooding that occurred in the Central Plains this past spring. You know, a tremendous amount of flooding. Well, it's because we've destroyed the soils. The soils are no longer able to infiltrate water. And then once that water infiltrates in the soil, we no longer have the carbon there to be able to hold it and store it. So we can heal this with regenerative agriculture. Then if you look at the issue with too much nitrates or phosphates in the water, well, by growing cover crops, by keeping a living plant in the soil as long as possible throughout the year, we're going to hold those nutrients on the landscape. And then, because it's held in a living plant in the organic form, it'll cycle through in time via biology rather than being washed away down the watershed. Then, if those of society who are concerned about human health, and we all should be, what's going to produce food in higher nutrient density? A very degraded soil or a healthy soil? On our ranch, we have not used any synthetic fertility since 2007, and yet our yields continue to increase. We produce ample yields to give us a profit. Where's all the nutrients coming from? Well, it's coming from the natural cycle. So we're saving all this fossil fuel that's used. You know, there's a tremendous amount of fossil fuel used to produce nitrogen, to transport the nutrients, to apply those nutrients. We don't have to do that on our farm or ranch because we're using the natural cycle. Now, if we're able to grow plants and animals higher in nutrient density, what will that do for human health? You know, I contend that the vast majority of society has never truly tasted nutrient dense food. Because if you taste truly nutrient dense food, your body knows it immediately, it craves it. What do we crave in society today? Sugar and salt, you know, things like that, that we shouldn't have. We just did some nutrient analysis on some of our products that we produce on the ranch. You know, the average omega-6 to omega-3 content of much of the beef being produced is from 12 to 1 to 15 to 1. Our grass-finished beef tested 1.3 to 1. I mean, that's tremendous. That's eating healthy. You talk about visiting with vegetarians and vegans, and on occasion they like to attend. I don't know if they enjoy it, but I think they relish the chance to heckle me some of my presentations. And so I ask them this. I just call them out and I say, okay, how many plants did you eat yesterday? And most of them will say, oh, I ate 12 to 15 different plants. And I said, well, the beef animal that provided the steak that I ate yesterday, the last day of its life, it ate over 100 different plants. I'm more of a vegetarian than you are. And how can they answer? You know, how can they deny that? You know, my body has access to all the nutrients from all those different plants that animal consumed. Isn't that what true health should be about? Isn't that going to provide me the nutrients that I need? Of course it is.
Well, they don't understand nutrient density. They don't understand this upcycling of nutrients. And that's why they'll say the cows are just the middlemen. And they don't understand that that's a very, very important. I could say, yes, maybe they are the middlemen. Yeah, great. They're the very important middlemen that give us access to this great nutrition and much more bioavailable nutrition.
Exactly. Exactly. The other thing we have to realize is the way we're producing our pastured proteins, whether it be beef or lamb or poultry, is they're out on the landscape. We're not hauling the grains to them. We're not using all these fertilizers and pesticides and fungicides and all these different things to produce them. Okay. So which is going to have the largest benefit and the least amount of carbon footprint? Well, it's our production model.
Yeah, especially not shipping in vegetables, let alone, from neighboring states, but all over the world, and fruits, that these vegans are eating.
Yeah, this morning it just so happened I took my son's girlfriend to the airport at 5:00, and I stopped at the local grocery store, and there was some peppers in there from Denmark. And I'm looking at that, and I said, how is that even feasible to ship a pepper from Denmark to Bismarck, North Dakota, and still have it looking the way it is, and do it in a cost-effective manner? Think of the fossil fuels that were used to do that. And then when you realize that pepper was probably picked 3 to 4 weeks ago, okay, how much nutrient density is going to be in that pepper?
Oh, yeah. No, they have studies that if it's not refrigerated properly or just amount of time, the nutrients go down. We know it's not as nutrient dense.
Exactly.
So, okay, this is something that's really bothering me. I'm making this film about the game changers right now. So it's on my mind. And, these James Cameron types, and there's all these people in the media and all these super rich people, Bill Gates, they're putting money into pea protein and like fake Impossible burgers and all these things. So do they not know that this is how to save the climate and the health of our environment is through regenerative agriculture? Or do they so either they're just not educated on it, or it's not popular to be on that side of animals because everyone has this perception they're bad, or it's just about money. It's hard to invest in regenerative agriculture, but it's easy to invest $140 million in a pea protein facility like James Cameron, because it's an easy return on investment. We tell people that meat's bad for the environment, that meat's unhealthy, then we sell them this cheap slop made of pea protein that has a huge carbon footprint to grow it.
Well, I wish I had an answer to that question, because I think it's a little of all of the above that you stated. I would like to think that they're more informed than they are, but if they really study the facts, there's zero doubt that regenerative agriculture and focusing on healthy ecosystems is the best route to go. It's going to actually benefit the nutrient cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle. It's going to benefit human health. There's no way in a lab you're going to create all these plant secondary metabolites, all these phenols, alkaloids, terpenes, all these compounds. It's not going to be done. They just won't be able to do what nature can do. And so it's probably driven some by profitability also. They see it as a feel-good story, a way to tug, so to speak, at the hearts of consumers, that they're benefiting the environment. But if you look at the true cost in fossil fuels and the carbon footprint, as you said, there's no way it compares to regenerative agriculture.
It's like trying to say we're going to go faster than the speed of light, right? It's
Right.
impossible, right? You can't, nothing in the lab can get better than nature, right? There's no way we're going to invent something that goes faster than the speed of light. It's just not possible. Everything's going to be subpar. And that's what is going to happen with any type of food. No matter what kind of cell-grown meat someone figures out, all the inputs it takes to grow it, all, just not being able to replicate these short chain fatty acids and just like all these different things that are in animal foods when they're grown properly. There's just no way you can replicate that, right?
No.
It's impossibility.
You're exactly right. And I think a lot of it is you don't know what you don't know. Dr. Chris Nichols is a world famous soil microbiologist. And Dr. Nichols first came to my ranch in 2003 and opened my eyes to the world of microbiology in our soils. And I remember back then she told me that she thought she knew 1% of what's occurring in the soil. Now I'm good friends with her and we talk often, and she tells me, Gabe, I know less than 1/10 of 1% of what goes on in the soil now, after studying it all her life. It's such a dynamic ecosystem. My business partner, Ray Archuleta, likes to say that the soil is self-organizing, self-regulating, and self-healing. It has the ability to change because biology is very adaptive. And so we need that. How are you going to replicate that in a lab? There's just no way you can.
It's impossible. It's so funny. I always make a joke about like the vegan and the Santa Monica coffee shop. They would say they know 80% about the soil. and the true expert knows 1/10 to 1%. They claim to know it all. They're like, well, yeah, they figured it all out. It's insanity.
I got to tell you a brief story about California and the production agriculture, because so much of the vegetables and fruit that we eat today come from California. And if you travel extensively through California like I have, you'll realize it's like most other states, severely degraded. And I was on a talk show. I was on from sitting here in North Dakota. I was on this talk show, and the host had on there a soil scientist from California. And I was explaining, just as I did to you, what we do on our ranch and how it's this utopia of all these different animal species and plant species. And, we're running chickens on our garden after we harvest the vegetables in the fall. And when I got done explaining, there was a break, and then the soil scientist come on, and the host says, what do you think of what Gabe's doing on his ranch? And she says, well, we could never do that here. When we produce vegetables, you cannot have any animals in contact with those vegetables. In fact, we even fumigate the vegetables before we harvest them to kill all life. And I couldn't help myself. I interrupted and I said, excuse me, you're fumigating the very same vegetables that you expect my grandchildren to eat. And it was funny. The host right then goes, we'll take a break now. He knew that I had her. Because that's just wrong. Look at how we're producing things. And then you have to get into the conversation of what are the negative ramifications on human health? The biology in our guts, in our stomach, is directly related to the biology in the soil. If we have healthy soil and children are going to play in that soil, and the vegetables and the fruits are going to have some of those biology on them, that's how you inoculate and have a healthy gut microbiome. Today, what are we doing in production agriculture? We're fumigating and killing everything, and then we wonder why society is so sick.
It's so obvious. Oh, I can't even understand these people. So do they not know about what you're doing? This person's a supposed soil expert. So do they not understand how soil works? Or are they just stuck in this paradigm and they can't see out of it?
But realize what the system, I don't care if you're a farmer, a rancher, a soil scientist, anyone involved in production agriculture, what have you been taught for the past 50 years? You've been taught that the soil is a chemistry set. It's a medium to hold a plant upright. We apply the nutrients, okay? That's what you're taught. That's the mindset. And then you look at all the pressures that are being put on. The fertilizer company, the equipment, the chemical companies, the commodity organizations, cattle growers, all of these different entities, they're pushing their agenda. So where's a person going to learn about regenerative agriculture, about how ecosystems really function? Well, you'd have to take the ecology classes. And there's some really good ecologists in our university systems, but unfortunately, they're not melding the two. You're not learning across disciplines anymore. That's just wrong. So we don't get exposed to it. I learned from my vocational agriculture classes in high school and then through 4 years of college. Then I learned from my father-in-law, but I was only shown the one way, until I had the good fortune of 4 natural disasters. I wasn't exposed to this regenerative agriculture.
Well, it's the exact same in the nutrition world, and all the studies are funded by the big food companies and the processed food where all the money is, and all the doctors are learning the same thing from the old textbooks. Oh my God, it kind of hurts your heads. Maybe I shouldn't go down this route. I'm going to get mad. But okay, a long time ago when we talked on the phone, you told me, I was like, why can't everyone do this? And you told me about the subsidy system, the crop insurance, and how you can't even fund this kind of operation. Let's go into that.
Yeah. So I often get asked, Gabe, if this is so good, why isn't everybody doing it? And I said, well, you have to realize how production agriculture, and I'm talking specifically in the United States, works, although there's several other countries that have similar type subsidies. In the United States, you prove your yield. In other words, what did my corn yield this year, last year, year before? You have to provide the government with those figures, okay, if you want to take part in their program. Then you're able to buy insurance, what's called revenue insurance, based on your past production history. So say, for instance, if you average 200 bushels per acre of corn over the past 5 years, you can buy percentages from 50 on up to 90% of that. So essentially, you could guarantee yourself the income from 180 bushels of corn per year. Now, the government also sets a price each year, and it's based off of the average of last year's price. Okay. The vast majority of farmers and ranchers require, in order to farm or ranch another year, they have to borrow money to pay fuel, rent, seed, fertilizer, chemical, all this stuff. So they borrow money. Well, the bank is going to force them to take out those insurance policies on their crops. Otherwise, they're not going to loan them the money. So farmers are stuck in this vortex, so to speak, where they have to go down this path. Well, the farmers, what are they going to plant? They're going to plant whichever crop the government says is going to allow them the most money through revenue insurance. Well, that's your big commodity crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton. Those are the ones. What that does is it drives overproduction of those crops. Now you're into the cycle where the farmer receives less and less, but the only choice they have is to stay in that or quit farming. Then you have peer pressure. You know, peer pressure is very, very strong. And I'll never forget back in 1994 when I moved to 100% no-till. I mean, my father-in-law laughed at me. All my neighbors laughed at me. You're going to go broke. That doesn't work. And you get ridiculed. Well, unless you have very thick skin, that's hard to put up with. And I tell people, well, that's why I don't walk into the local coffee shop. They'd stop talking. They wouldn't have anything to talk about because they're talking about me all the time. Mm-hmm. It doesn't bother me. I have thick skin. I don't care what people think about me. So you have these different pressures going on. That makes it very hard for farmers to move down this path. Now, in saying that, we are seeing real momentum, especially every year it gets considerably more. You know, I've been down this path 20 plus years. And I mean, man, for years we were pushing the snowball uphill. Now it's finally, we're at the top. It's starting to roll downhill because of the financial situation in particular in this country of most farmers and ranchers, many farmers and ranchers. They're driven. They have to change. They know they can't keep farming and ranching the way they are. Mm-hmm. You know, every day I take phone calls and emails from farmers and ranchers all over the world, really, but that are being driven away from the current production model to the regenerative because they said this isn't working anymore. You know, we're not healthy. We're not financially healthy. We're not mentally healthy anymore. We need to do something different. So we're on the verge of a real change, and that's good to see. Can't come fast enough as far as I'm concerned, but it's coming. You know, now we're seeing companies such as General Mills announced last year that they were focusing on regenerative agriculture. And I'm very proud of the fact that they hired us, my partners and I at Understanding Ag, to work with their producers. And we have projects going in Canada and the Northern Plains and in the Kansas wheat belt and now in Michigan. And so it's coming. It's coming quickly.
Well, that's great. I think 2 years ago you didn't mention General Mills, but because you didn't want to say yet, but that you
Yeah.
were working with these people that. So it's funny that how this works is the big companies, they see where the money's going and they're like, oh, well, people are into this. Now let's do it. And they're kind of trying to pretend they knew it all along, or, oh yeah, this is, we're so into this regenerative ag stuff.
Yeah. And let's be honest here, they're a publicly traded company and, they're driven into performing for their stockholders, but they see that this is the future. This is the way that they can get adequate supply of high quality product year after year. That's good for their business. They see that moving down the regenerative path is more profitable for the farmers and ranchers. That's good for their long-term business. And I give them a lot of credit. They have stepped forward in a big way. They believe in this, and they're going to really help propel this to the next level.
Well, that's great. I mean, money drives everything, and it's consumer demand drives everything too. So that's part of the solution, is that consumers are demanding this, and therefore the market moves.
Yep. And that's one of the things you mentioned it earlier, that there's no one out there paying to do the nutrient testing of these foods. Is there really a difference? Well, our company, Understanding Ag, this year was involved in a project where we're actually looking at that. We are taking soil tests on regenerative farms and then on neighboring farms. And then we're growing the same variety of grains and fruits and vegetables on both those farms. And we're testing the nutrient density of those products. So we gonna see the results, but the preliminary results we've seen are pretty dramatic. There is a major difference in the nutrient density of those products. And so our whole goal is to have open source education for consumers, industry, businesses. Hey, this is what's occurring. And then let the consumer be the judge. Which product do they want to buy?
Yeah, and you said most people have never tasted real nutrient density. I got to tell a little story.
Okay.
Well, I went up to Canada to Slow Down Farmstead. She's a woman on Instagram, Terra Couture. I've talked about her a lot. She raises all her own food. That is something I've never tasted. Her nutrient density is an entire different level. Your body can feel it, like you said. Nothing can compare to the food that she cooks and grows and butchers herself, and everything is done herself. And also, you talked about the omega-6 omega-3 ratio. Actually, I have a company called Nose to Tail, and I'm partnered with a ranch in Texas, and we have a 1.5 to 1. So right around where you guys are at with 1.3 to 1. So
great.
Yeah, I mean, there is a difference.
It's huge. I had a film crew here a few years ago, and they were looking at our laying hens. We have 1,400 laying hens out on pasture, just roaming freely. And they asked, well, is there a difference between these eggs? And so I told them, well, tonight when you go back to town, you stop and buy any eggs you want in a grocery store. Just doesn't matter. You pick what kind. So they did. And the next day they were all proud of this dozen eggs, and I'm not going to name names, but they had this dozen eggs. Then I let them go out into our egg mobiles out on the pasture and pick whatever eggs they wanted. It was up to them. And then they started cracking them open side by side. Well, they just could not believe. They cracked open the whole dozen of their eggs, a whole dozen of mine. And the difference is, it's night and day. And when you taste those eggs, it's to the point. I travel a lot. And the hardest thing about traveling to me isn't up with the airplanes and airports and hotel rooms. It's the lack of nutrient dense food by far. And I carry most of what I eat with me because I just can't stomach eating other food. It's just not the same thing. This is the hardest thing to describe to people, is the nutrient density, because it's something, it's difficult to measure at a price you can afford. Then who's going to do the testing? And then the fact that the vast majority of people have never, ever tasted nutrient dense food. They have nothing to compare it to,
Well, yeah, I didn't know anything about it before either. And yeah, and you're talking about these eggs and just the color of the yolk, really. It's
Oh,
just this
yeah.
rich orange yolk.
Oh,
And
it's unbelievable, the difference. As a matter of fact, I'll finish a little story about those eggs. That film crew then left. 2 years later, I get an email from them. Gabe, we produced the documentary and we were run it by the test audiences. And the number one scene in the movie was them cracking the eggs open at my place. So they flew a film crew out again from LA and spent a whole day just cracking eggs open because they wanted that exactly right
wow.
for the movie. That had that dramatic of an impact on the audience, their test audiences, you know.
Well, maybe I should take note of this because I actually was just filming something for this other film I'm making, and I had to buy these cheap eggs at Target because we were gonna kind of waste them. And then I took them home. I was like, oh, I should eat these. And the yolk was like a yellow highlighter. I didn't even want to eat it. It was a joke.
Yeah. When they were filming this for a whole day, so they brought all these eggs from town and, you know, to different brands. And then I just let them go out and pick right out of our egg mobiles. And they would actually take their finger, you know, and you barely touch the yolk of the other eggs and it just broke open and ran. And you could bounce your finger off of ours, you know, before it even broke. And they were just amazed by that.
Well, I might have to steal that for my Food Lies, my main film.
Oh, sure.
These visual things are what people respond to. And I noticed in the Game Changers.
Yeah, and in my presentations, I always have their picture of the two eggs side by side and the difference in them. It's just mind blowing. We did nutrient testing on our eggs too, and it's just what they kind of, you know, they're just so much healthier. I mean, it's not even comparable.
Well, I don't know how you can convince someone of this without
they
them
have
trying.
to taste it. They have to taste it.
Well,
you
they
have to get it in their mouth. Yeah.
But then they even have to know. Well, I guess humans inherently know how healthy it is once they taste it. But I mean, I'm here arguing with online vegans and all this stuff, and they're like, "Oh, well, you know, my diet's so good, and you don't know this, and you don't know that." And I'm just like, "Hey, well, you experience that."
Think of it this way. Okay, we've all gone and eaten spinach or lettuce in a restaurant, and I love spinach, but I'll only eat spinach off our garden because the rest of it to me is just like chewing on a piece of cardboard. You know, I mean, you go in and buy this stuff that in the commodity type model produced on degraded soils. There's no nutrients. Your body's going, what is this? What are you trying to put in me? You know.
Well, people don't recognize the difference between, you know, having real nutrition and not. So, and price is hard. I mean, it's hard because you can't see it. It's like I could buy some spinach at Target, or you could buy your spinach, and it's so hard because you don't see it immediately, right?
But the thing is, we have to get down the mindset. I'll never forget. I'll share this little story with you. So we're set up at farmers market one Saturday selling product, and this lady comes up and she was looking over the prices standing in line, and she goes, "Boy, your food's pretty expensive." We didn't say a thing. The guy behind her in line says, "Ma'am, I just had triple bypass. This food is cheap." And I thought, wow, that's a testament.
That's great.
There, you know, but we have to start thinking of food as health. And the only way we're going to do that, we have to bring the medical community more on board, realizing that there's a difference. Now, I got to tell you one other story. This is kind of a sad one, and this one has bothered me ever since it happened. But about 6 years ago now, I was in Illinois, and I was at a private type function. I was given a little banquet speech, and it was a lot of doctors, lawyers, accountants in the room and that. And I was talking about my ranch and what we're doing. And after I was done, a doctor stands up and he actually says this to me. He says, "Gabe, what you don't realize is we make our living writing prescriptions." And I looked right back at him, and I just fired back at him. "Did you not take an oath also?" You know, because that just really bothered me. And I'm not saying all doctors are like that, but unfortunately there are some. And I thought it really summarizes our healthcare now. It's nothing about preventative. It's about just treatments, you know, and we have to get back to the preventative model, and that's nutrient dense food.
It's the same thing you're talking about. You're stuck in the system with the crop insurance and all that revenue insurance. This is the system. It's hard because even doctors who want to switch, I have a business partner in Sapien with Dr. Gary Schliffer. So we're here trying to do actual preventive medicine, actually changing the way people eat and live. And you can't, it's almost impossible to just make a living. He has this whole medical practice. Like, how do you pay for it? We have to use creative techniques to try to even make a few dollars to actually educate people instead of prescribing them medicine.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I believe it, and the cost to become a doctor, and yeah,
it's
Yeah.
insane. So how do people switch? Right. We'll kind of try to wrap things up here. So if the system's against them, how do they get into regenerative agriculture?
yeah. So our business, Understanding Ag, that does the consulting work. Right now, we're on over 15 million acres across the United States and Canada. And what we do, we go to a client's, and the first thing we do is see what they're doing on their operation. What does their soils look like? And we do take certain soil tests that show us how that soil is functioning. From those tests, 95 plus times out of 100, we can immediately start reducing their synthetic inputs. And so that saves them money from year one. And if it saves them money, puts more money in their pockets, that gives them the confidence to start down this path, using other of the principles to move further down the path. And the more confidence they get, the quicker they'll move down that path. And I tell people, moving into regenerative ag is just like climbing a set of stairs. Okay, you start by, okay, we're going to go no-till. Okay, we're going to plant a cover crop. Okay, we're going to diversify the crop rotation. Okay, we're going to integrate livestock. And as you do that, you increase profitability. As you do that, you increase profitability, and you also improve your family life, your mental health. It's good all the way around. And we're providing a real benefit to society because we're providing clean air, clean water, and nutrient-dense food.
100%. It's all connected. This is the same steps of implementing your new diet and lifestyle. And you take it one step at a time, and it benefits all the other things like your mental health and family. Okay, you kind of talked about rotational grazing and cattle and using the animals, but you kind of just mentioned just what, on a high level, how does it work to integrate animals and plants together? Because we're separated right now.
All of us can imagine back. We've seen videos and documentaries on this country and what it was like, pre-European settlement. And it was this wide array of different plant species and animals and insects all work in harmony with each other. Well, that's the way it kind of is on our ranch. We look at our role as just kind of basic caretakers, but the ecosystem itself tends to balance and take care of itself. So we're growing, instead of just one or two cash crops, we have a wide array of different cash crops. We go corn and peas and wheat and barley and oats and rye and triticale and all these different forages. And then we grow cover crops. So we're growing our cash crop. We're growing cover crops beside. And then we integrate livestock onto those cover crops to consume a part of them. Now I say a part because we're going to leave a large amount of biomass to protect the soil. And then we don't only graze one livestock species such as beef cattle, but we got sheep and we got hogs and we got chickens and we have a honey enterprise. And so we have all these different enterprises on the same acreage. I'm often asked, okay, Gabe, but how are you going to feed the world in your production model? And I laugh at them. And I said, okay, so you have a corn farmer. He grows corn on a field, right? And he's done with it. That's what he did, was grow corn. Well, I'm not only growing corn, we're producing beef, we're producing lamb, we're producing pork, we're producing honey, we grow vegetables, we got fruit trees. I'm doing all these different enterprises. Who's going to feed the world? I'll produce way more net calories of energy per acre than any of them will. And they can't argue that, and the other thing is I'm going to do it at a lower cost because we don't have all this overhead, all these inputs.
It's so funny. It's the exact opposite. without pesticides, herbicides, fungicides,
Yep.
without
Yeah.
nitrogen, soil. What's
Well,
it called?
I tell
Fertilizer.
people this. This just when we're putting on our Soil Health Academy schools, above every acre, there's approximately 32,000 tons of atmospheric nitrogen. 32,000 tons. Yet farmers are writing checks for nitrogen fertilizer.
Mhm.
I said, to me, that just makes 0 cents. 0 cents. Why would you need to write a check at all? All we got to do is take it out of the atmosphere, put it in the soil. All we need to do that is we need legumes, or you need nitrogen fixing bacteria. We don't talk about all those things in production agriculture. Why? Because it can't make the co-op money, right?
Mhm.
You know, the co-op's not going to tell you to do that, because how are they going to sell you something?
Yeah. Okay, so we can feed the world. This is one of my main questions. I'm trying to put together a presentation on just a lot of things, but one of the big points is how to feed the world in the future and how, we can make a food model that's also works with environment and all that kind of stuff. So, do we have enough land? There's these arguments. I had to do a debate with this vegan lady. It's like, we don't have enough land. There's no way we can feed the world this way. We have to do this, it's just all with plants. That's the way to do it.
Wow, that's just ridiculous. You know, last figures I saw were from 2017. Approximately 7.2 billion people on the planet. We produced enough to feed 10.2 billion people. Okay, we have problems with infrastructure, problems distributing that, problems with governments, etc. We don't have enough problems for any problem producing food. And then you move to a production model that's regenerative, where you're actually stacking more enterprises per acre. We're going to be able to feed the world on much fewer acres than is needed today. And then we have to get into the whole debate on ethanol and all that. You know, as I said earlier, much of what we're producing today is really not food for human consumption anyway. It's foolishness.
Well, so just in the land in the United States, you kind of know these figures, like how many acres we have, and then if everyone did a kind of farm like you did, you have about 5,000 acres. How many people could we feed in the United States?
That's a good question, and I honestly have not done the math. But right now, we're exporting the vast majority of what we produce. We could be producing for the United States to feed the United States population on a much, much smaller percentage of acreage. I have not done that math. That's now you kind of spurred my interest. I might have to do that math. It's much smaller fraction than what you would think, though.
Well, I bet. So if someone had 5,000 acres of corn, what is that going to help compared to your 5,000 acres doing all the enterprises you talked about? So I want to do the math, and I saw some kind of paper, and maybe we can collaborate on this because I would really like to include it in the film or just get it out to the public. Just using common sense, it seems very obvious that we could feed ourselves using regenerative agriculture and all the methods you've described.
Yeah, my business partners and I, we're writing a book to that effect, where we're going to, in the book, lay out the case of why regenerative agriculture. And we're going to talk about the current production model and then what the regenerative model has to offer. And so we'll look at that exact thing. It's just such a flawed system we have in the U.S. right now that we need to get away from that. Not only in the U.S., but around the world.
Huh. Okay. Well, this is very obvious to you and I. I'm glad you guys are writing this book, and hopefully we can, work on some numbers even on the side. And I'd like to get them out in Food Lies. So what kind of closing words? How do you think we can get this message out there better? Or what? I know you're doing your business, and it's great to help people, but what's your closing words on this?
Well, like I said earlier, there is nothing that can bring society together as can regenerative agriculture. Right now, we're in a very polarized society. There's no need for that. If we sit down and explain the facts and what regenerative agriculture can do, no matter if you come at it from the aspect of climate change, water quality, human health, the environment, biodiversity, let's agree. We can all agree on 80+% of this. Let's move down that path together. The other 20% will work itself out. Let's just move down the path together.
I like that. Yeah, it's more of a, it shouldn't be a war. I don't like being in this war against vegans and these different ideologies. I just want to say we agree on 80% and we should be working together.
That's right. And, so often I get asked, well, the organic people, they get upset because we're telling them don't till as much. The conventional type producers get upset at us because we're telling them don't apply so much synthetics. Hey, let's all move down this together. I'm not saying don't use any synthetics. I'm not saying don't till at all. The vegans, I'm not saying don't be a vegan, but just realize the ramifications of what you're doing. That's all I'm asking.
Yeah, that's the main goal, I guess, is be open to this information and don't just shut it down immediately and say that animals are killing the world. And that I guess that's the great message to end on is at least let's have the mainstream media and world just understand this. And so we can move towards it together. So thank you so much. And hopefully I can get out to your farm someday, maybe for the second film or ranch.
Would love to have you here. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening, everyone. Come back next week for another great guest. Give the show a review. Go to sapien.org to find out more about all the stuff we're doing. Check out nosetotail.org for some grass-finished meat. And say hi on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. Until next week, stay happy and healthy, and eat densely and move intensely.